Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Spring 2018 Wall Exchange Lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. And as we enter this evening into discussion of culture and understanding across cultures, it becomes ever more important to consider our relationship as Canadians with the Indigenous First Peoples of this land. My name is Philippe Tortel. I'm the director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors who have helped to make this evening possible. That includes the Global Reporting Center at the University of British Columbia, the Georgia Strait, and the Tyee. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our wonderful house band, so to speak, the Strait Jackets, who are Rod McDonald, Gerald Bowie, Andy Stack, Stephen Webb, and the Peter Wall Institute's very own Brett Finley. The Peter Wall Institute was founded a little over 25 years ago as a space to bring some of the world's leading minds together to engage in deep and sustained and critical conversation about complex issues that matter to society. A very important part of our mission is to translate and to share the outputs of our research and our scholarship with broad audiences through formats that are engaging and publicly accessible. We do that through a variety of means, including various conferences, books, and our signature event, where we are tonight, the Wall Exchange Lecture. This lecture has been running for something like 7 or 8 years, and it has allowed us to bring some of the world's leading thinkers and scholars to Vancouver to engage with us in this sort of deep exchange of ideas. And we've been very, very fortunate to attract a wonderful cast of speakers over these years, and tonight is certainly no exception. Ali Velshi is a journalist and a global affairs correspondent. He works at NBC and MSNBC and has previously worked at a number of other outlets, including Al Jazeera and a number of Canadian organizations. He has covered an incredibly extensive range of issues from global terrorism, gun violence, the Iranian nuclear deal, Arctic issues, and many other things. He became a household name in the United States and across the world during the 2008 financial crisis, where he took it upon himself to really explain in understandable terms the complex knot of interactions that seemed to bring the world to the brink of financial crisis. He did so with honesty and clarity, helping to explain to people the origins of the crisis and what it meant for them as individuals on a day-to-day basis. He's come back into the spotlight over the last year as he has been front and center in perhaps what could only be called the political circus that is unfolding to the south of us. And again, he stood out for his courage, his honesty, and his integrity as he has held people accountable to the truth and has challenged all kinds of nonsense that has really been spouting in an attempt to really understand the causes of an apparent unraveling that's going on. The issue of culture and its fragmentation and its used as a weapon, as he'll discuss, is one that is rather personal to Ali. Unlike Barack Obama, Ali actually is a Kenyan-born Muslim. He immigrated to Canada in the 1970s when the cultural face of this country was undergoing radical change. And he grew up in the region of Toronto. He attended Queen's University and, as I said, established his early journalism career here in Canada. From there, he moved down to the States and so therefore took on the notion of a secondary immigrant as a Canadian living in the United States. And so with this identity as a double immigrant, the idea of culture and what it means and how it defines us becomes a very personal thing to him. He has won numerous awards, been nominated for Emmys and many other things. He's involved not just in journalism, but in a lot of community service, including outreach with some of the most vulnerable people in New York City, where he lives today. The format for tonight's event will be as follows. Ali will give a 40-minute lecture approximately, and then we'll leave about half an hour for questions and discussion. That discussion period will be moderated by Professor Peter Klein, Peter Klein is a journalist and a professor at the UBC School of Journalism and the founder of the Global Reporting Center. Peter is an accomplished academic and an accomplished journalist, having worked for many years in New York as a producer on 60 Minutes and has contributed significantly to the New York Times. And his reporting over the years has garnered a number of significant Emmy Awards. Peter is also, for those of you who may recall our lecture from Cedric Villani, a closet mathematician and a jazz pianist. So tonight's evening promises to live up, I think, to the ideals of the Peter Wall Institute, where we seek to understand complex issues unraveling in the United States by taking into account deep understanding and study and honest examination of these challenging questions. And I hope that at the end of tonight's evening, we'll have a lot more clarity, or at least some clarity, as to where the future may unfold. So I'd like to ask that you join me in welcoming Ali Velshi.
Good evening. I want to thank you, Philippe, and thank the Wall Institute for having me here. And untraditionally, I'm going to have to begin with an apology. I'm certain that many of you have attended tonight under the assumption that you'd be hearing from an expert on the issue of the weaponization of culture. I'm not that person. What you have in me instead is a student of the topic. I am more of an observer than an expert, and what you're about to hear is not even a complete thought. This tonight is a starting point of a journey that I am undertaking to understand culture, identity politics, the dangers and consequences of weaponizing them, and what we can and should do to stop the weaponization of culture. You are, therefore, test subjects for some of the ideas that I've researched. If you applaud points that I make, I'll know that they're keepers. If you boo, do so loudly and clearly, so I know to rework those sections for subsequent lectures. But as I said, this is an incomplete thought. I've bitten off much more than I can chew with this topic, and there are many tributaries that I've chosen not to take. The entirety of the weaponization of culture, for instance, can be discussed through the lens of the effect of trade relationships on wages and unemployment. But since you are not prisoners and you're free to leave at any point, I decided not to explore that for the purposes of tonight's lecture. However, if the Canadian Society of Reciprocal Trade Agreements comes calling, I'm ready. To understand the weaponization of culture, we need to understand culture, and we need to understand identity politics. I think we all think we know what culture is, but when we use the word, we can mean many things. For instance, when we use the term culture, do we mean, one, customary beliefs, social forms, material traits of a race, religious, or social group? Or two, do we mean characteristic features of everyday existence that are shared by people in a place and time, as in Southern culture? Or three, do we mean a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, conventions, and practices? American anthropologist Clifford Geertz calls culture, quote, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about attitudes toward life. 19th century English anthropologist Edward Burnett Tyler said culture, quote, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Neither of these two seem particularly interested in women as participants in culture. Perhaps more simply, Mahatma Gandhi said that, quote, a nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people. So I think we understand culture, or at least I understand culture, to be the context in which we experience life, the social constructs we develop collectively, and the ways in which we adapt, evolve, or perpetuate those constructs. I'm going to say that one more time. Culture is the context in which we experience life, the social constructs we develop collectively, and the ways in which we adapt, evolve, or perpetuate those constructs. The problem obviously arises when our social constructs or mores fail to serve the collective, but rather serve constituent elements of it. And when other elements, those who are not feeling the benefits of those mores, want to adapt or evolve, there is that resultant pushback. by those who wish to perpetuate the way things are. In the case of Make America Great Again, retreat or return to the glory days. It is status quo versus disruption. And at the heart of this disruption to the status quo lies some basic forces: justice, equality, liberty, opportunity. The disruption takes shape through something we have come to know as identity politics. Merriam-Webster describes identity politics as politics in which groups of people having particular racial, religious, ethnic, social, or cultural identity tend to promote their own specific interests or concerns without regard to the interests or concerns of any larger political group. It's an instructive definition. I think it's unfair, though, because it argues that the promotion of a group's interests is undertaken, quote, without regard to the interest or concerns of any larger political group. Harvard psychology professor Steven Pinker calls identity politics a syndrome in which people's beliefs and interests are assumed to be determined by their membership in groups, particularly their sex, race, sexual orientation, and disability status. It originated with the fact that members of certain groups really were disadvantaged by their group membership, which forced them into coalition with common interests. Pinker argues that the interests of some are not always completely served by their membership in the larger group, so they seek coalition with others who share their political interests. Now, this is important to understand because we are all ultimately members of a larger group. Our national citizenship, employees of a company, members of a trade, our gender, our sexual orientation, or our political party. But perhaps in some cases, the goals of these larger groups are too large to serve all of their constituents. So, identity politics is a splintering of sorts into narrower interests. Columbia Humanities professor Mark Lilla says that participating in identity politics means, quote, going out into the democratic space where you are struggling for power and using identity as an appeal for other people to vote for your side. Look, these are all very varied descriptions, but I think they help provide some texture to how we think about identity and identity politics in the current political environment, particularly in the United States, but also in Great Britain as it relates to Brexit, Germany as it relates to post-war democratic conditions and its struggles with the integration of East Germany and its subsequent struggles with the integration of refugees from the Middle East, and France with its struggles with underlying extreme right-wing elements and its anti-immigrant tendencies. But I want to go further back than that, to the period between 1914 and 1933 in Germany, the Weimar Republic. Just prior to the rise of the Nazis, Germany was a hotbed of literature, visual art, design, theater, dance, cinema. It was a center for science and intellectualism in which Albert Einstein flourished and won a Nobel Prize in 1921. And more importantly, Germany was a multicultural society in which Jews played central parts in politics, the arts, scientific, and economic affairs. Jews enjoyed the freedom to partake of their distinctly Jewish culture while being welcomed into German culture as full participants, at least relative to Jewish inclusion into broader European culture from about 1095 AD to that point. The experience of Jews in Germany from about 1914 to 1933 gives us a taste of identity politics, though it wasn't a perfect example of it, and of course back in those days it didn't go by that name. I want to take you back to that flawed but interesting Merriam-Webster definition of identity politics. Politics in which groups of people having a particular racial, social, ethnic, or cultural identity tend to promote their own specific interests or concerns without regard to the interests or concerns of any larger political group. This definition, of course, wouldn't be true of pre-World War II German Jews, because while they wished to promote their specific interests, it was absolutely not done without regard to the interests or concerns of any larger political group. Jews in Europe didn't have that luxury. But like certain groups in today's politics, Jews were both inside and outside the German politic. Jews in that era headed a few of Germany's largest corporations. They were prolific in business. A Jew headed a major German mainstream political party and was foreign minister for the time. Many of Germany's wealthy were Jews, as were its doctors, lawyers, and university students. but it wasn't a natural place for them. Resentment built among non-Jewish Germans, and with each greater success and achievement, it built further until the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in 1933. Hitler took the cultural identity of Jews and turned it into a form of neo-identity politics in order to rally the larger political group, namely members of the Nazi Party, and still larger, the entire non-Jewish German population, to a cause. Hitler had to convince non-Jewish Germans that the pursuit and practice of a distinct cultural identity by Jews, combined with their reaches into higher and higher levels of German civil society, constituted not just a threat, but an existential threat to the German nation, a threat that needed to be challenged with political force. Hitler made the success of Jews in Germany into a zero-sum game. Now, let me be explicit. I am using Nazi Germany because it is the most complete picture of a modern, educated, enlightened industrial democracy which created space for culture, in which it all went horribly wrong, and in which the worst of humanity prevailed over what was arguably one of the world's most advanced and integrated cultures. I am not comparing anything in the world today to what happened in Nazi Germany. It simply offers the most vivid example of all the preconditions for success, resulting in utter and absolute political, moral, and human failure. And as such, it is instructive to this discussion. But I implore you to resist the urge to draw lines where they do not exist. America today, more than Great Britain, Germany, France, or Canada, is in fact the most complete picture of a modern, educated, enlightened industrial democracy which created a space for culture in which it could all go horribly wrong. Not in the way that Germany went wrong, but in a way that a global leader can become a secondary player where the worst of humanity can take root and prevail over what is today one of the most advanced and integrated cultures. So let's examine where we are in America today and the role of culture, identity politics, and politics. Participation in identity politics may be based on shared experiences of injustice, of differentiation and distinction from the mainstream, a sense of social or economic grievance, and a desire for redress. Identity politics is, as the label suggests, inherently political in that it has a political, social, or economic goal, and the goal is often empowerment. And the empowerment of marginalized groups or the disruption of the status quo inevitably creates conflict within the mainstream or larger group, especially when the mainstream has historically enjoyed privilege, whether its members realize it or not. The action that marginalized groups take or need to take often stands in sharp contrast to the desires of the status quo or the inertia that is often experienced by those who have no complaint with the way society is working. While cultural and identity politics are different things, they are related in that identity politics only comes into play when something about culture, the larger, enveloping culture, is threatening certain of its members. And the threat's not always what you think it is. Consider the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866 at the end of the American Civil War. The American South at the time was facing remarkable upheaval. The sheer idea that millions of blacks who had until then been partial participants in the whole of society would suddenly become influential and in some cases dominant was a threat to the then dominant white Southern culture in the United States. To this day, defenders of the Ku Klux Klan are quick to dismiss arguments that it was based on racism or racial prejudice. They say it was formed as a resistance to the Republican Party's policies that were aimed at social and economic equality for blacks, which they felt would displace their culture. It was a protection of their culture. Many Southern Confederate apologists still argue that the Civil War was a fight about white culture. Southern culture, they like to say, not slavery or white supremacism or racism. Unlike today's resistance in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan was inherently violent. But so was Nelson Mandela's African National Congress in its role as resistance against the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. So were the Black Panthers, formed as a resistance against the brutality of American police against African Americans. All three groups aspired to political control of their societies. Now again, I'm introducing incongruous examples to provoke thought, not to elicit the many good reasons why one should not equate the ANC with the KKK. All of these movements and so many others that we both revere and despise are examples of identity politics, movements that develop when groups feel that something key to who they are, white Southerners, black South Africans, people subject to police brutality, being a Jew, is challenged or needs to challenge the status quo. Identity politics then is complicated. If identity politics is imperative to repairing damage to one's culture, it may follow that it needs to be weaponized to succeed. And it may also follow that the culture being targeted for redress may weaponize in return. That, it appears, is what we are witnessing today, not just in the United States, by the way, but around the world. We have culture wars, if you will, all over the world, but wars in this context connotes competition. Weaponization is something perhaps more serious. Weaponization of culture is the conversion of identity politics into political action for a particular goal not achieved by the tradition of debate and compromise that has characterized much of the recent Western democratic history. We're not talking of competing narratives here, but the brute force of elections or something more immediately potent than the ballot, waged from a cultural rather than a purely ideological perspective. We're talking about media wars, we're talking about zero-sum politics, and most importantly, we're talking about lies. Growing up, I knew of black consciousness, I knew of gay pride and feminism, but those things have seen major evolutions. I saw gay politics evolve from persecution to liberation, to pride, to a movement to achieve equality for members of the community and representing the common interests of people who were prepared to unite politically around their sexual identity. This is a movement which, by employing identity politics, has moved from the margins into the mainstream in record time, with gay marriage and economic and social rights, and at the moment, an important U.S. Supreme Court case about cake. You know you've made it when the Supreme Court is debating your wedding cake. I saw race, you can clap for that. It's all right. I saw race politics evolve. I was puzzled as a child growing up in 1970s Toronto when I was called a Paki. I went out of the way to tell the person who called me that in fact my family, not only was my family not of Pakistani descent, but when my family left the Indian subcontinent around the turn of the 20th century, Pakistan was half a century from being born. I was amused, unaware that the intent of the epithet was not informed by a sophisticated understanding of British colonial history. But that it was racism having to do with my appearance. Back then, I was just a kid, growing up in Toronto, vaguely aware that I was brown, but equally aware or hopeful that I was Canadian. My politics was not rooted in identity. As a kid, it wasn't really rooted in anything. I'm not sure I had any politics at all, much less any sophisticated sense of identity. Race identity is perhaps best exemplified in the United States today by the Black Lives Matter movement. Unlike the civil rights movement and the black empowerment movements, Black Lives Matter is, at its most basic, a response to police brutality against blacks, but more fundamentally, it's a response to white cultural hegemony in America. Its goal is to create a national conversation around African American social and economic inequality and police accountability. In response, there's a much less organized and more inherently political All Lives Matter movement. It's not really a movement, but it symbolizes a fundamental refusal by those who enjoy privilege to engage intellectually with a set of valid concerns shared by people of color, and a refusal to acknowledge that American institutions have not and do not value all lives in the same way. That is not to say that there can't be a logical and legitimate counterpoint to Black Lives Matter, but All Lives Matter isn't it. It's just a silly reactionary slogan to a critical and long-standing socioeconomic issue. In the predominantly white suburban neighborhood where my wife and I spend our weekends outside of Philadelphia, people have started putting up lawn signs that proclaim, "We support the police." It's a perfectly reasonable statement to make, but I wonder whether my neighbors understand the inherent hatefulness of the message, or that they've fallen into a cultural trap in which, having never been frightened of interactions with the police, they are undermining those who are. It's complicated because none of us dispute that society would collapse without police, who by virtue of being public employees are de facto supported by us through our taxes. Nor can we dispute the fact that all lives should matter. But by putting up those signs, or wearing those shirts, or sticking those bumper stickers on, my neighbors too weaponize culture. Theirs is not a casual message about, what's all this fuss? Rather, it's a statement saying, I understand there's a cultural battle raging between blacks on one side and police on the other, and I'm joining the battle, and I'm taking a side. And in this case, they're siding with the dominant culture. They are actually weaponizing the status quo against those who would disrupt it. Police serve and protect us, but at the same time, in American cities, they shoot a disproportionate number of unarmed men of color. We are capable of holding both thoughts in our minds and choosing not to weaponize this crucial discussion. To push back against the weaponization of culture, it's worth exploring the issues around which people in our time weaponize. As we've seen from the examples we've already discussed, race, ethnicity, language, and religion are obvious, as are gender and sexuality. Increasingly, though, income and economic class distinctions are drivers as well. This shouldn't come as news to any of us, by the way. Think back to Paris, 1789. Fresh off support for a bunch of former British colonists whose identity politics had created an entire country, things weren't so great for common French folk. In fact, peasants were so poor and the cost of food so high that many starved for the lack of something as basic as bread. In 18th century France, the rich were born rich. They were exempt from taxes, which were only paid by the working and middle classes. And like almost all over the world at that point, there was no other way to be wealthy than to be born wealthy. The deteriorating French economy and class tension caused the lower classes to rise up and behead their oppressors. Berkeley sociologist Arlie Hochschild, the author of 9 books and most recently 2016's Strangers in Their Own Land, writes after spending 5 years in the rural bayou country of Louisiana that some Americans are so disenchanted with their economic situation and with government that they've taken to voting against what would be in their own economic interests because, and this is my interpretation of her words, not her words, their identity politics drives them to support the Tea Party, ultra-conservative Republicans, and Donald Trump. Their pervasive complaint is that other groups, women, immigrants, racial minorities, and gays, all cut in line ahead of them, taking government handouts and basically stymieing their opportunity to achieve the American dream. Through a reliance on single sources of news, if you can call some of these things news, like Rush Limbaugh and other right-wing radio, they've developed deep-seated animosities for so-called feminazis, environmentalists, gays, blacks, and immigrants. These people have been feeling this way for some time, but when Barack Obama came along, it basically underscored the historical disadvantages that these groups faced. It made the largely older white male population feel, in Arlie's words, like strangers in their own land, a sentiment that the Tea Party was ready, willing, and able to weaponize. A journalist who hails from a poor Southern background shared with me that since leaving the South, she understands how her understanding of basic things has changed. To her, good is taking a pluralistic approach to race and faith, in which knowing and interacting with people of different backgrounds and approaches is additive to one's life experience. But to some of those with whom she grew up, who have been left behind, valuing and protecting one's race or religion is good, and attempts to do otherwise are fundamentally a challenge to what they hold to be important. Both Arlie and my colleague point out that poor rural Americans feel forgotten, like outsiders, part of a socioeconomic and political landscape they don't recognize and cannot access, much the same way that many women, gays, and minorities have felt for much of American history. Economics are always at the root of a much more insidious, dangerous form of identity politics, one which we're seeing rear its ugly head in America today, nationalism. While some think nationalism is a good thing or at worst neutral, to me it's always a negative. Nationalism and its ugly offspring, nativism, have given space to tragedy, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and the Holocaust. But in almost all the cases I've studied, there's an economic root to it. Even in Germany, pluralism reigned during strong economies, but anti-Semitism took root in tough economic times. We are resistant to the fact that economic cycles and industrial evolution, global trade patterns, or even our own merits and failures are responsible for our fortunes. We believe in ourselves when we do well, but we find others to blame when we don't. And there are other more specific reasons why culture gets weaponized in some societies more than in others. In America, we have growing political concentration and polarization. Most of you know what gerrymandering is. It's the reason why only a quarter of the 435 U.S. congressional districts are considered competitive. Only a quarter of the seats have any degree of likelihood of changing parties. That's because in 3/4 of all congressional seats, there are either so many Republicans or so many Democrats that there is no chance of a flip. And that means there is no motivation whatsoever for members of Congress in those districts to ever compromise with members of the other party. Gerrymandering, by the way, is named after a guy whose name is spelled like Jerry, but it's got a hard G, Eldridge Gerry. He was the governor of Massachusetts. He was once the vice president of the United States. He so manipulated the state's Senate boundaries in Massachusetts in 1812 to benefit his party that one such district was said to be shaped like a salamander. Hence, geographically manipulating electoral districts to favor one party over another came to be known as gerrymandering and ultimately gerrymandering because of how it's spelt. It's now part of American culture. Generally speaking, though, when you stop using county boundaries, major roads, rivers, valleys, mountains as boundaries for election districts, that's a problem. But more than these arbitrary lines, a writer named Bill Bishop argues in his book, The Big Sort, Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart, that Americans are actually self-selecting around identity politics, although he doesn't use that time because he wrote in 2008 before the term had become popularized. The Economist back then wrote this review of his book, and I'll quote, "Income is a poor predictor of party preference in America. Cultural factors matter more. For Americans who move to a new city, the choice is often not between a posh neighborhood and a run-down one, but between several different neighborhoods that are economically similar but culturally distinct," end quote. Another issue with American politics is outlined by University of Pennsylvania President Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson in their 2015 book called The Spirit of Compromise, is the degree to which the ridiculous United States campaign finance landscape has caused members of Congress who are up for election, as you know, every 2 years, and therefore are constantly campaigning, to devote more and more of their scarce time to meeting with lobbyists, moneyed interests, and to attending fundraisers rather than concentrating on the work of government or spending time with people with whom they can debate rather than agree. There is simply no space or time for compromise on the American congressional landscape right now. The primary system in the United States also favors the extreme over the center. Moderates hardly vote in general elections, let alone participate in primaries. Consider the moderate Republican candidates in the last presidential election, Jeb Bush and John Kasich. Remember John Huntsman in the 2008 Republican primaries. I think I've made my point. Finally, as my colleague Fareed Zakaria of CNN argues, the decline of political parties may be the most important development here. To be a candidate, whether you want to be dog catcher or president of the United States, generally speaking, this election notwithstanding, you had to capture the spirit and imagination of members of your political party first and foremost. And a successful political party was, by definition, a big tent. You could be to the left of the Democratic Party or the right of the Republican Party, but ultimately there were parameters and a platform and party leaders who helped shepherd everyone toward moderation. Well, the big tent has collapsed. Americans on the right think that parties are made up of elite sellouts, and Americans on the left think that parties are made up of elite sellouts. Political parties generally aren't great homes for identity politics, although there's growing literature about how the Republican Party has become the home for religious conservatives, mostly concerned about abortion, absolute gun right activists, and anti-immigrant hate groups, while the Democratic Party has been overtaken by extreme liberal groups who put social equality ahead of economic gains. I'm not sure of any of these theories. I haven't studied them, but they're floating around enough to warrant mention. Interestingly, Trump apologists, on the one hand, and the resistance, on the other hand, use very similar language to describe their current political leanings. Fear of the other side, anxiety about the economy, fear of violence, although for some that manifests in the right to own a gun, and for others it's the fear that there are too many guns. Liberal economists worry that even talk of restricting legal immigration will result in Japanese-style economic stagnation because the United States has a dangerously low population replacement rate. Conservatives, on the other hand, worry that immigrants bring crime and take jobs away from working Americans. On this issue, the conservatives are wrong. America has record high number of job openings right now and record unemployment. In fact, the number of posted job openings in the United States almost exactly matches the number of people officially looking for work, but those looking for work have neither the right skills nor live in the right places for the jobs that are available. But ultimately, all of this rational talk about the economy and citing statistics is for naught, because the weaponization of culture is about scapegoating, making excuses, casting blame, and using easy explanations, that success and prosperity is a zero-sum game, rather than the real explanations, which are far more complicated and nuanced. The weaponization of culture begets absolutism. If they win, we lose, so we've got to win, and they've got to lose. This is the tribalism to which humanity resorts when our backs are against a wall. A common refrain of Trump apologists is the lack of respect accorded the president, including and especially by the media, which Trump supporters complain constantly find fault in even small things the president says, and in particular in his speech and his grammatically challenged tweets, and his seeming lack of nuanced understanding of most important issues. Trump supporters feel that that disrespect and condescension extends to them. They will cite Obama's 2008 comments referring to working-class voters in old industrial towns that have been decimated by job losses. Quote, "They get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy to people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiments as a way to explain their frustrations." Trump supporters also point to Hillary Clinton's September 2016 comments in which she said, quote, "You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that, and he has lifted them up. He has given voice to their websites that used to have only 11,000 people that now have 11 million. He tweets and retweets their offensive, hateful, mean-spirited rhetoric. Now, some of these folks, they are irredeemable, but thankfully, they are not America." End quote. The allegation of racism seems to sting particularly, though some scholars say that a black president, let alone a Kenyan-born Muslim one, was the last straw. It symbolized a movement from lip service to affirmative action to a complete overturning of a political structure that made millions of Americans feel safe. A black man was in the White House. Gays were marrying everywhere you looked. Women were free to get abortions. The Second Amendment was under siege by gun-hating Democrats, and perhaps most importantly, there were movements afoot for young black people shot by police. But there was no movement afoot for rural white Americans with a high school education who worked or used to work in the factories or coal mines that were the backbone of industrial America that built a middle class that was the envy of the world. What is less reported, by the way, was the second half of Hillary Clinton's comments in that very same speech in September of 2016. She said in the first part that you could put half of Trump's supporters into a basket of deplorables. What'd you say about the other half? Quote, "That other basket of people are people who feel the government has let them down. The economy has let them down. Nobody cares about them. Nobody worries about what happens to their lives and their futures, and they are desperate for change. It doesn't really even matter where it comes from. They don't buy everything he, meaning Trump, says, but he seems to hold out some hope that their lives will be different. They won't wake up and see their jobs disappear, lose a kid to heroin, feel like they're in a dead end. Those are people we have to understand and empathize with as well." End quote. You didn't hear that much. No. Now, while calling millions of your fellow Americans deplorables is a dangerous strategy, there was nuance and texture and context to the entire statement. Trump apologists, it seems, don't recognize the racist underpinnings of Trump's immigration policies, never mind the fact that Trump himself has a long history of racism, starting in the 1970s when he and his father's real estate company went to great pains to not rent apartments to blacks. To his full-page newspaper ads calling for the death penalty for the Central Park Five the black and Latino youth who were later exonerated after being convicted of raping a white woman in Central Park, to his 2015 call for, quote, a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, to calling Mexicans rapists and drug dealers on the very day he declared his presidency. In June of 2017, Trump said 15,000 recent immigrants from Haiti all have AIDS, and 40,000 Nigerians once seeing the United States would never go back to their huts in Africa. And of course, you all remember the Charlottesville, Virginia rally, probably the clearest recent demonstration of the weaponization of culture in America, because a white culture warrior, meaning a culture warrior for white people, ran his car into a crowd, killing a woman. The president's most memorable response to that incident was to remind a grieving America that there were, quote, some very fine people on both sides, and that the press had treated them very badly. In the very moment Donald Trump could have decided not to assist the weaponization of culture, he took a side, and he took the wrong side. President Trump's key immigration advisor, Stephen Miller, regularly quotes from a study written by Harvard's George Borjas, which is at best controversial, but more generally simply discredited. The spurious study aims to show that immigrants lower wages for the native population. Now, I've studied this study. It's simply incorrect in its assumptions and in its conclusions, but it underpins the Trump administration's anti-immigrant policies. The United States has a labor shortage that the Trump administration has difficulty accepting, but when it shows signs of understanding the fact that the United States does actually need immigrants, it wants to make sure the problem is remedied with white European immigrants. The unnecessary end of the DACA program, which allowed young Americans who had entered the U.S. illegally with their parents before they were 16 years of age, is an example of the damage that these types of policies cause. By the way, for those of you, I mean, you probably all follow it, but these were undocumented immigrants who were low priority for deportation because the decision to come to America was not theirs. They spoke English, they were either in school or had graduated, had no criminal records, and were generally contributing to society. Upwards of 80% of Americans, I've seen some polls putting it at upward of 90%, believe that these 800,000 plus young people should stay in America. America is literally kicking out tax-paying, law-abiding, productive young people who haven't known any other home since they were children. The Trump administration, and prior to that the Trump campaign, said their efforts at removal of undocumented immigrants would focus on so-called bad hombres, or convicted serious felons. The administration repeatedly said of deportations that if you haven't committed a crime, you have nothing to worry about. But we have covered story after story of undocumented Americans deported without any felony offense, and in most cases, no criminal record at all. I recently interviewed a young woman named Viviana Morales. Her college admission essay was published in the New York Times 4 years ago. In it, she wrote about her struggles in getting through high school because her family was constantly on the move and couldn't afford Wi-Fi, so she learned how to borrow Wi-Fi from unsuspecting homes, positioning herself within range but outside. You guys should all check your Wi-Fi security. On a visit home to Colorado in October of 2017, while she was an undergraduate and during a routine visit to immigration authorities with her father, who had no criminal record and had worked and paid taxes in the United States since 1998, was taken into custody. 2 months later, he was deported to Mexico. His daughter will graduate from Yale University this weekend. In case you haven't got a clear enough picture of how the Trump administration weaponizes culture, think back to January of this year when President Trump asked out loud and in front of U.S. senators, why do we want all these people from shithole countries coming here? He reportedly also talked about getting more immigrants from Norway. His comments don't require much interpretation. Chief of Staff John Kelly spoke to NPR in May of this year, saying of undocumented immigrants, quote, they're not people that would easily assimilate into the United States, into our modern society. They're overwhelmingly rural people. In the countries they come from, 4th, 5th, 6th grade educations are kind of the norm. They don't speak English. So when you consider that America, like Canada, is a nation largely of immigrants, those who argue that the Trump administration is weaponizing culture may have a valid argument. This isn't, in the minds of some, group pitted against group. This has echoes of nationalist governments embarking on a mission to create a society based on ethnic, linguistic, and religious preferences. I have, to great criticism, compared those specific tendencies to tendencies that drove Germany in 1933. It is foolhardy to ignore the similarities. Conservatives call liberals who worry about these things triggered snowflakes. Have you heard the term? It's derogatory. It comes from the 1996 book Fight Club, in which the protagonist tells his herd of anarchists, quote, "You're not a beautiful and unique snowflake. You're the same decaying organic matter as everything else." So to accuse somebody of being a snowflake is to deliberately undercut their identity politics by suggesting that their concerns are insignificant. But on the issue of President Trump and his apologists following a misinformed immigration policy quite possibly steeped in racism, the triggered snowflakes may have this one right. One more important strain to examine here is the frequency with which the Trump administration calls for curtailing the media. As recently as this month, Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "The fake news is working overtime. Just reported that despite the tremendous success we're having with the economy and all things else, 91% of the network news about me is negative, in brackets, fake. Why do we work so hard in working with the media when it is corrupt? Take away credentials?" In October, Trump tweeted, quote, "With all the fake news coming out of NBC and the networks, at what point is it appropriate to challenge their licenses?" In February of last year, he tweeted, "The fake news media is not my enemy. It's the enemy of the American people." In April of this year, in the same tweet in which he expressed support of the conservative Sinclair media gaining control of a greater share of local news stations in America than regulators generally think is appropriate, Trump tweeted, quote, "The fakers at CNN, NBC, ABC, and CBS have done so much dishonest reporting, they should only be allowed to get awards for fiction." The attacks on the media, combined with the attacks on law enforcement, the FBI, and the judiciary, are reminiscent of some of the darkest moments in recent human history. In 2014, the military junta in Myanmar labeled the Burmese language newspaper, the Irrawaddy, as an enemy of the state. Myanmar is now engaged in what some are calling a genocide of the Rohingya people. In 2007, Hugo Chavez shut down RCTV in Venezuela and then made a televised address on all channels declaring the media group, Global Vision, his next enemy of the state. Venezuela is today descending into chaos. In 1997, Russian state media labeled a small regional newspaper that held government to account unpatriotic and, you guessed it, an enemy of the state. It subsequently closed. Media and politicians critical of the Russian government are now routinely jailed, and some are killed. In Rwanda in 1993 and 1994, hate radio was used by Hutu extremists to demonize the Tutsi and encourage hate and violence. Stories of oppression and humiliation that had been handed down from Hutu parents and conspiracy theories of government were whipped up by extremist politicians to produce a pathological hatred of the Tutsis. The radio was highly effective because of the country's lack of literacy and the targeting of the unemployed, the delinquents, and the gangs of thugs to defend Rwanda against the invasion of the Tutsi, who were referred to as cockroaches. An estimated 800,000 people died in the genocide that was a direct result of this orchestrated media campaign. In Yugoslavia in the 90s, Serbian-controlled media ruled the airways during the Bosnian genocide. Reports of NATO troops bombing, shooting, and gassing Serbs were the only reports on television and radio, resulting in the demonization of Bosnians. Building on preconceived ethnic hatred led to more and more acceptance and support of the resulting genocide. Morally bankrupt governments thrive on the disorientation and the chaos that these types of attacks engender. Since Trump's election, the Washington Post, which like MSNBC is a frequent target of the president's, unveiled its first ever slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." The slogan is a hat tip to a comment made during a decision during a Watergate era by a judge named Damon Keith. It may be the best newspaper slogan ever and probably the best tagline for journalists everywhere. Democracy dies in darkness. But enough bellyaching. Let's get back to the topic at hand, the weaponization of culture and what we can do about it. This is where the research stops, and my quarter century as a journalist and my half century as a human comes into play. Ultimately, injustice against some has got to be seen as injustice against all. Among the few truths that have emerged in human history are that absolute freedom and equality are better than the alternatives. But the weaponization of culture works because it is easier than the alternative. It is easier than self-examination. It takes less work than meritocracy. It takes less thought than pluralism. Zero-sum is simpler math than 1 + 1 = 3. That said, how much intolerance are you expected to tolerate in your mission to de-weaponize culture? Arlie Hochschild of Berkeley told me that when she spent all that time in Louisiana, where they complained about feminazis like her, and environmentalists like her, and coastal elites like her, and liberals like her to her face. The only way she could manage to stay engaged in the dialogue was by turning her words, turning her personal alarms off, because otherwise they'd be going off so loudly she wouldn't be able to listen. And unless you listen, you can't hear. 20 years ago, I sat down with Yo-Yo Ma, who was embarking on his Silk Road project. He was literally taking musicians from Central and East and South Asia and recreating, musically, ancient trade routes which connected people long before we decided that we were all different and incompatible. The music was different. The instruments were different. There was no obvious way that these musicians from all over the world were going to perform concerts and entertain crowds and create mutual understanding through music and sustain that for decades. You had to stop thinking about the incredible racket the instruments would make in competition with one another, because if you didn't stop thinking about it, you couldn't listen to the harmony, the beautiful melodies that they would make. And as Yo-Yo Ma said, unless you can listen, you can't hear. We can't stop believing in our cultures. We cannot subjugate them to some larger whole. We are who we are, and without our experiences as browns and blacks and gays and straights and whites and rich and poor and differently abled and immigrant and refugee, thank you, Canada, and Jews and Christians and Muslims, we're just small, lonely islands. But we can't just be with each other. We have to listen to each other, because unless you listen, you can't hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That
Thank you,
was
Peter.
Incredibly insightful. Last time I was up here, I was speaking with a Fields Medal winning mathematician. I feel like I'm amongst greatness once again. So thank you. So there are microphones. We're going to take some questions, and if you have a mobile device and you have Twitter, feel free to tweet your questions with a hashtag #WallX. And I'll get them on this little device here, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. Let me start while people are lining up to the questions with a question to you. Your topic here is weaponization of culture. One might argue that journalists like you are the counter weapons. You are famous for many reasons, not the least of which that you hold Trump and his surrogates to account in a way that few, if any, other journalists do. Do you feel, not to question your self-worth here, but do you feel like you are achieving that goal of countering that weapon? Or, the other argument, and it was explored in the New York Times this past Sunday, is that the sort of elite media approach is actually undermining that and emboldening Trump supporters even more, and may ultimately lead to his reelection.
It's a brilliant question, Peter, because I don't know the answer to it. I think what I do and what I try to do and what my colleagues try and do is we engage in meaningful debate. And challenge number one is, we are guest-driven shows on TV, so inviting people who sit outside the comfort zone of some of our own viewers. And that alone creates certain pushback. So making sure that we don't stop the conversation, that we don't give up on the opportunity to talk to people who hold other views is important. Number two is really holding them to account. Whether they are liberals or conservatives, we have to treat them similarly on television. We have to make sure they're telling the truth. We have to ask them questions on behalf of our viewers, and we have to engage them in debate. But I always find it interesting that in some of the most heated debates I've had that end up on YouTube or going viral, the very people who I've interviewed and I've had those debates with, who sometimes I think, boy, I did a real great job with them, they won't come back again, have posted that stuff on their websites. So in their view, they are showing their supporters that, see, I wiped the floor with this Velshi guy, or see the kind of questions that the media ask, or see the bubbles that they're in. So I think this is a constant learning experience. The only takeaway I have, and the only thing that I'm trying to carry through, is the ability to continue to engage in the discussion with people who do the things that I've talked about here, who engage in the weaponization of politics and identity, I think, and culture. I think I've heard people who say that the answer to dealing with them is the ballot box and defeating them, and I've heard people like Arlie Hochschild who say the answer is engagement and empathy. And it is hard to empathize sometimes with people who promote the stuff that I just spoke about. But I don't think there's a choice. If we are going to live in evolved democratic societies, then they've got to be for everybody. And if there are segments of society, rightly or wrongly, who feel left out and left behind, we have to treat that as seriously as we do other movements that seem to be easier for us to digest.
Well,
Thank you.
if those of you who haven't seen some of the clips of Ali holding people to account that's gone viral, it's worth looking at it in YouTube, because he's pretty much on fire there and really holding people to account in a way that you don't see very often. So, question over there?
Sure. With respect to the discussion on illegal immigration this evening, so far you have focused on the comments associated with President Trump. My research suggests that going back at least to President Bill Clinton, State of the Union, 1995, through President Obama, State of the Union, 2013, Senator Clinton, New Hampshire, Town Hall, 2015, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, sir. They too talked about immigration. They talked about building the fence. They talked about all the budget initiatives. So my question is, in terms of talking about the weaponization of culture and the weaponization of illegal immigration, who is the parent of it? President
That's a great
Trump
question.
or President Clinton, President Obama, Senator Clinton, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi? Sir, they all have a long record of saying these types of things. Am I wrong?
Well, you're only wrong in that you only name Democrats. There was a President Bush and a President Reagan involved in there, too.
Correct.
So I can sort of see where you're going with this. But your question is very sophisticated.
You focused on one person.
Right, because he's the President of the
harshly.
United States who's weaponizing the debate. The fact that the United States has had a remarkably unsophisticated approach to immigration for decades is a fact. That the Democrats have not solved this problem when they were in power is a fact. You're absolutely right about that. There's no question. But none of them weaponized it the way Donald Trump did. Donald Trump has, and there are people sitting at the southern border, as you know right now, that caravan that came in from Central America. There's, where I live in New York, there's a Statue of Liberty that has a message inscribed on it that is not the message that those people are hearing on the southern border. It's quite likely that those people are actually refugees. So I get your point, and it's valid. American politicians have done a uniquely poor job of understanding and dealing with immigration and have let it build up to crisis proportions. Donald Trump is not the father of this at all, but he has weaponized it. So it's not about solving the problem. It's not about illegal immigration. It's not about all of these things. It's about something else. It's about rapists and criminals and shitholes and bad people and not being white people. That's the distinction. That's the weaponization. We could have a whole different debate on handling immigration in the United States and how poorly that's been done, but that's the distinction here.
Yeah. So let me just close with this thought. Today, our Prime Minister, in a commencement address at New York University, drew a line, it appears, from people who do not support the idea that human beings cause all of the climate change, or any of it, depending on it, to the issue of female genital mutilation. With respect to the New York Times piece on whether or not the type of presentation of the issues, as you've done tonight, is contributing to the prospects that he'll be elected, let me tell you, as a university-educated, self-employed person with none of the fears of the people in the southern U.S., I hope he's reelected.
All right. No, don't do that. Don't do that. No, hold on. You're invited here to have this debate, and that's why we're doing it. So let's have a round of applause for that conversation. That's what it's for. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Let me go to a question from Twitter, from @Danielle_YVR. Philippe Tortel, the director of the Peter Wall Institute, started by acknowledging we're on the ancestral land of the Coast Salish people. In the United States, you know, as an American journalist like you, we don't cover indigenous issues very much.
You do it way better here than we do in America.
Pretty much, yeah. So here, it's much more progressive in the media, but there's still lots of issues. And so there's a thoughtful question here. How can we talk about the weaponization of culture without mentioning settler colonialism and the marginalization of indigenous populations?
No, you can't, and that's a brilliant question. You can't. It's not a complete question. It's not a complete debate if we're not considering all of those things. if you are going to solve these problems, if you're going to work against the weaponization of culture, then it requires that you concern yourself with matters that are not imperative to you in the moment, right? And it's a big problem, Peter, you and I have seen in the news business for a very long time. Unless you can relate a story to people, they're not that interested in hearing about something that either happens hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away or hundreds or thousands of years ago. But they are relevant to who we are as a people. And until we can completely treat each other with the respect that we deserve and we right the wrongs of the past. I mean, just last week, wasn't it, that Prime Minister Trudeau apologized for turning back a ship of German Jewish refugees, European Jewish refugees, many of whom ended up perishing in the Holocaust as a result of not being allowed into Cuba and the United States and Canada. And a number of people tweeted that, so what? What does it matter now? Well, it matters. Your memory matters. How you treated people in the past and how you evaluate that through the lens of 2018 is relevant. If we're that much smarter and that much more informed today, then let's unearth everything we've done that hasn't been right and try and do what we can to make it right. So I think it's absolutely the case.
Thank you. What do you think of Islam?
Boy, how much time do we have? Yeah, I'm going to have to give you a short answer to that one. Islam is it's a difficult word and has been in the United States certainly and probably globally since 9/11. So before 9/11, there was sort of a benign neglect or misunderstanding of it altogether, and that after 9/11, it became kind of important to ask the question you just asked, and it belies an easy answer, right? It's a religion. I can't answer Islam in this. What do I think of Islam in the same way that I can't answer what I think about Judaism and Christianity. I can answer questions about the politicization of Islam. I can answer questions about fundamentalist interpretations or literist interpretations of a number of religions. But I'm a Muslim. I grew up with a religion that I didn't think set me apart from the society in which I was welcomed, and with the one exception of that guy who called me a name, I have thrived in. And I have always believed that the values, the religious values that my parents instilled in me, which I believe to be religious values that have been derived from Islam, were entirely compatible with the world in which I live. What I have learned subsequently is that other people have interpretations of Islam that don't believe mine are valid, and to them theirs are valid. And I don't know how to have that argument, and I don't know how to have that debate, and it's something that I think Muslims around the world are struggling with and have struggled with for a long time. So on one hand, when people do bad things in the name of Islam, if it is entirely an interpretation of religion that's not one that I share or ever understood to be the case, why am I more compelled to answer for that than you are? Because it's as foreign to me. People who commit crimes and kill people in the name of the religion that I have is as foreign to me as it would be to you. On the other hand, society demands answers to the question that gentleman just asked, and it's a valid question. And I apologize to you that I don't, after years of studying this, have a better answer for you. I know what my faith is, and I know what my religion is, and mine lives very comfortably in and around yours, whatever it may be, and if it's nothing, mine lives around yours as well. But I understand there are people who have the same label for their faith that I do, whose faith doesn't live comfortably next to yours or next to you, and that's a challenge that we're all going to have to face. That's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best one I can come up with, but it was a great question.
And you were one of the few, perhaps only, really visible, openly, kind of public about your faith after 9/11.
Yes.
And so this was a question that was constantly put to you.
Yeah, I mean, considering
and you
that
were
I've
constantly answering.
Considering I've had 17 years to think about it,
Right.
that was a pretty bad answer.
All right, we'll move on to another question. James Correa asks, do you believe that the mainstream media shares responsibility for Trump's win and the proliferation of identity politics?
Yup.
Okay? So what could we in the mainstream media have done better in the lead up to the election and since the election?
You know, if I were given the choice, I'd eat nachos for every meal. But at some point, we have to realize that that's not good for you. So we have to employ that sort of discipline that our doctors make middle-aged guys like us employ in our coverage of the news. At some point, I get that people liked watching Donald Trump on TV. But unless we are able to provide the context around it, like a few vegetables before the nachos or maybe a green juice afterwards, don't do it. We let go of our responsibility writ large as journalists to provide context around Donald Trump because he was substantially more TV savvy and interesting than John Kasich or Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton to some degree. She's not, you know, Hillary Clinton's really smart, but she's not, she doesn't do what Donald Trump does on
but I
TV.
mean,
People are tiring of this, by the way, but
we don't make these decisions though. Every time Trump's on TV, ratings go up. Every time he's not on TV, ratings
yes,
go
and that
down.
is, by the way, starting to change, interestingly enough, unless you're at Fox. Yeah, we bear responsibility. We don't really have formulas, as you know, about how we take who we take, right? We take things that we think are newsworthy and TV-worthy. And I definitely think in the run-up to the election, you know that Les Moonves of CBS said, it's bad for the country, but great for TV. Yeah. And now we've got him. So that is something every journalist needs to think very, very carefully about, that always present context. It's not the issue of airing everything Donald Trump does or says, and now that he's president, you kind of have to. People say, why do you? Why don't you just ignore him? Well, because he's the president of the United States. He might get us into war with a tweet, so we actually have to pay attention. But I hope that we have learned some lessons, and we'll see in the next few months and the next 2 years.
We'll go over here and then we'll go over there.
I love your show, by the way.
Thank you.
My theory is that the dumbing down of American politics started actually with the nomination of Sarah Palin. And that really ushered in a whole new breed of dumbed down politicians who didn't know squat. I want my politicians to be smarter than I am, to know more than I do, because I look to them. Mm-hmm. My question really is, that was actually my tweet you just read, by the way, so I'm cheating.
So you got two?
Oh.
I like the way this guy works. Weaponization of Twitter.
Yes. But when we look at, I think you used to formerly be at CNN at one point, and now you're with MSNBC.
Yes.
Is there some affinity to politicians, to journalists actually saying you're lying? When we have so much evidence that a politician isn't telling the truth, either it's on the left or the right.
Good question. Really good question.
Can we just say,
yeah. So I say it. I
Sarah
say
Sanders,
it.
you are lying.
Yeah, no, I say it. And I do say it. And it's really weird in the journalistic world because sometimes people don't like that you say that. It makes you feel like you've taken a stand on something. And the distinction tends to be that when you accuse someone of lying, it is as if you were accusing them of deliberately lying. That's the distinction. So, for instance, I know that the White House watches what we do, right? So the first time Trump talked about NAFTA and he talked about the trade deficit that the United States has with Canada, I corrected that on TV. I didn't accuse him of lying. I said that that's strange that he wouldn't know that, but it's unusual. And I did that for several days. And then when he kept making speeches about it, I said, okay, I know that you guys watch us because we get feedback from the White House on things we do. So I know they're watching. So you know that you're wrong. So now you're lying. Now it's deliberate. And where that line gets crossed, some of us have taken to saying it. Not everybody does. Some people think that that means you're going out on a limb as a journalist into a foreign land. You're going somewhere that journalists shouldn't go.
Even when it's inauguration size.
Right. Well, I think the inauguration was a great example of that, right? That was the first place where people said, I've got eyes. I mean, you're lying.
Yeah.
Right, the New York Times, boldly made the decision to use the word lying in the headline over this
And
very issue.
so thanks to Donald Trump, we're evolving as journalists. We're realizing where it becomes acceptable. I don't mind the fact that, generally speaking, journalists had respect for institutions and were cautious about how they use those terms, but Donald Trump has taken us into a brave new world where If you're lying, we're going to have to say you're lying.
Okay. Thank you.
More and more lately, people have been living in bubbles, bubbles of what they hear, what they see, what media they consume. Often those bubbles are not necessarily by choice.
Correct.
What you click on, what you look at, what you search online becomes all that you get.
Correct.
You get more of what you look for. And often it's that what you see creates an emotional response that causes you to shut it out and just ignore it and find ways to avoid sources of that thing, that emotion. So I have a hard time thinking of a way forwards in a time where we only see things that agree with us.
Yes.
And if we see something that we don't agree with, we instantly
Right.
shut it out.
Right.
So I was hoping I would get your idea on what
So
we
it's
could do
the
to go
question of our
forward.
time. This is the intractable problem of our time, and that's why I ended my comments with the idea that if you don't listen, you can't hear. So if you're not even going to try and listen, you're not getting anywhere with this. And that's the whole problem with the weaponization of culture, right? That if once you've decided that the other side isn't even there to listen to, you've shut it out. You know, that's something you could do today that you couldn't do 10 years ago. Social media is a big part of the problem, and Facebook is learning that they've got to do something about it, and that's part of it. Back in the old days, before social media, but after emails, you all remember you all had an aunt or uncle who sent you crazy stuff, and it was a thread that had been forwarded 16 times, and it was all indented, and you had to stop. Someone had to stop it. Someone in the family had to say, "Stop this nonsense." And now we don't. Now it's harder because people like things and share them, and it's just harder, and it's taken on a new life, and you don't have who's supposed to police this. So there are a couple things here. One is there's an element of responsibility, personal responsibility here, and of teaching those who are less internet savvy or those who live in those bubbles that they have to actually actively get outside of those bubbles. We worry about listening to or consuming news that is from a place politically that is not where we're comfortable. I think there are two important concerns. One is that we don't listen to things across the spectrum. We listen to things on one side of the spectrum. And then, depending on who you are and where you're getting your news, you may just be getting fake news. So we need to get everybody a little closer to the middle in terms of their consumption. I don't need to change your political leanings in any way, but wherever you are in the spectrum, you really should try and consume trustworthy information from somewhere else on the spectrum. But that assumes you know how to find trustworthy information. And when you're getting so much of your news off of social media, in particular Facebook, as we know, that has been a problem. And you said that it's, the concept of clickbait, the idea that these are emotional responses that cause you to click on things and like them and then get more of them. Well, remember, that was always the case, right? That's what headlines are for. That's what that thing at the bottom of the news, the thing that has the headline in it, we hire people who write those to get emotional responses. The difference is on the news, you still just got what you got. If you read the newspaper, you just get what you get. With social media, it multiplies, and you just don't even know it. So part of the work that we have as people who have decided that we want to work against the weaponization of culture is to make sure that in the bubbles in which we operate, we deliberately include and invite other voices, reliable, trustworthy voices. For my audience, which tends to skew more liberal than not, that means inviting conservative, trustworthy voices whose views are not shared by many of my viewers, but that's not the point. The point is you need to be able to debate, but you need to be able to trust that this conservative who I've brought on is telling you the truth and not a lie. So it's hard work. That's the big one that you've just identified. So do your part in stopping your crazy aunt and uncle from sending stuff, but telling other people around you to open up their minds. If you're that smart and you're so confident in your ideas, be prepared to debate it, or at least read something from someone else. I think that'll help. Thank you.
There are a number of follow-up questions related to social media, but I'm going to let this gentleman, because I really like his AC/DC T-shirt.
I was going to say, if you got an AC/DC T-shirt, you get to ask a question.
You get to jump ahead.
All right, so I think that the view of the different US presidents and their immigration policies has really changed over the years. So do you think that overall the United States and Canada, their immigration policies, over the years, have they gotten better or worse?
Well, so, I think of the big monumental change in Canadian immigration policy being Pearson and Trudeau, who realized that as society prospers and as Canada takes its place in the pantheon of developed nations, birth rates are going to fall, right? And with the exception of Quebec, that's what happened. But taken as a whole, our worker replacement rate was going to fall. So if Canada continued on the trajectory that it was in, let's say, 1966, 1967, we'd be a provincial little country that would not be punching above its weight. So Pearson and Trudeau made a conscious effort to say, we're just not going to be able to populate our country properly unless we have fairly aggressive immigration policies. There was an economic imperative to that. And by and large, until about within the last 10 years, Canada has largely followed similar policies. Things have changed in the last 10 years that I don't think are necessarily better. But the United States has a completely different problem. Canada's problem is finding a skilled workforce, right? We don't have this threat of people coming over the southern border, generally speaking. American perceptions of immigration are all rooted in this idea that people are storming over the border and they're coming here and taking our jobs. It's a very different concept. Most CEOs in America say, our biggest problem is I can't get skilled workers for my jobs. Right? I need more H-1B visas. I need more engineers from India. I need more Chinese. I need people who are prepared to come here and do this work. Or we need our schools to churn out more engineers, or whatever it is that we happen to need. But that's the American psyche for decades has been to worry about illegal, low-skilled immigrants coming over the Mexican border. The strange part about that is that they overwhelmingly work in the service and agricultural sectors, which has kept agricultural costs very low. So Canada's immigration policies have changed. America's have just not kept up with the time. They're just wildly old-fashioned and unsophisticated. And to this gentleman in the front row's point, nobody has fixed this in 40 years in America. Democrats didn't fix it, Republicans didn't fix it. It's changed in that we've decided immigrants are, particularly non-white immigrants, are dangerous and bad. But we haven't actually fixed the underlying problem. We still don't actually have enough people for the jobs that we do. So I'm loving all these questions. No, I haven't had an easy answer yet. I don't think Canadian immigration policies have gotten better, but I know that U.S. immigration policies haven't gotten better.
Let me ask a follow-up question. As a Torontonian, how do you feel about the onset of Trump Light, via Rob and now Doug Ford, using many of the same tactics Trump used during his election on a smaller scale? Do you see comparisons between what's going on in this country and the United States, or is that a false?
Yeah, I mean, the Rob Ford election was for very much the same reasons. Somebody looking at it empirically would not think that Rob Ford had been the better candidate. But he appealed. It was an emotional response. There were a lot of people who I never would have thought would have voted for Rob Ford who did, because they were sick of it. It was a throw the bums out. This is a guy who says what he thinks. He sounds like me. He's going to get it done. And to this day, that continues to be the response of a lot of Trump supporters, that he says it like it is. I'm sorry it doesn't sit well with you, but he says it like it is. He's getting it done. He doesn't work within the constraints that apparently get nothing done. And in a place like Toronto, where, the city council is a bureaucracy, that's very appealing. Toronto is, for people who study municipalities, Toronto is a weak mayor system. So it doesn't actually matter whether Doug Ford carries on and says the things that he says, because he can't do some of them. Donald Trump is finding the same thing in America, that he can't do some things, although he's not really clear on the separation of powers and the co-equal branches of government, so he thinks he can, but he can't do all of it. So that's kind of the issue. But yeah, I definitely am fascinated when I look at Toronto politics and I see this happening again, or Ontario politics and see it happening again.
Sit over here.
Thank you. First of all, it's wonderful to see you here. I'm very concerned that Donald Trump has weaponized incivility, and that it cost many dozens of people their lives this week in Palestine. The weaponization of incivility is a very serious matter, and it rises above the ridiculous and the lies. It goes to life itself, respect for life itself, respect for the rule of law, and respect for civil society. My tweet question was, given all these events, when is Trump going to be impeached? But you could, well, I'd ask you to weigh in on either of those, because the incivility is a dangerous weapon of war. And with an addict as serious as Donald Trump is a serious addict about being incivil, how do you stop him from doing so much harm, including in Charlottesville?
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to divide your question into 3 bits because I can answer them separately. First of all, I'm not of the belief that Donald Trump is going to be impeached, but not that I know anything that anybody else doesn't know. I think that the answer to people who don't like Donald Trump is going to have to be at the ballot box. And I think that as unsatisfying as that may be to some people, it's actually the most satisfying response in a democracy. So that's probably what people have to think about. And I want to just put aside the issue of what went on in Israel and Palestine and Gaza for a second, because while I believe that there will be no peace in Israel and Palestine without the leadership of the United States is not the only player contributing to what happened this week. What happened this week should hurt everybody very deeply. And that's a separate issue, and Donald Trump can help that issue, and he has shown no desire to do so. And I don't know how well he understands it, and I don't know what's behind that, but that's a different topic. The issue of civility is major. It is a very, very, very big deal, and that's the one that plays out in the streets of America every day. And that is of great concern, because while it's great, the gentleman over here a few minutes ago was saying he wants his president to be smarter than him. Some of the appeal of Donald Trump or Rob Ford back in the day was that you feel like them. You want to go for a beer with them. And this whole business about wanting to go for beer with the president always made me confused, because I don't want a president who ever has the time or inclination to go for a beer with me, because they're doing other more important things. Now, remember, in fairness, there are a lot of Americans whose criticism of Barack Obama is that he was aloof, right? You didn't have that problem with George W. Bush, and you didn't have that problem with Bill Clinton. Everybody thought Bill Clinton was their buddy. But there is a reaction to people who thought Barack Obama, very smart guy, intellectually very, very capable, but aloof. Donald Trump doesn't come across as aloof. He's personable, and he's like you. But to people who think that the examples for civility are set in places like that, this is problematic. And it has given license to people to say misogynistic, sexist, racist, homophobic, Islamophobic things. It's a fact. That is anti-Semitic things. Donald Trump has contributed to that. He's not the only contributor, and Donald Trump didn't invent himself. So I think that he is a symptom of something, but I don't know what else to say beyond that. It's unfortunate, and I think that that's something Americans are going to be thinking about. But I will tell you, if you're watching these primaries, there are a lot of people either winning or coming close to winning who are out-trumping Trump. So there's an element of society in America that wants to keep going down this road. So I'd watch it carefully.
Thank you.
So I don't know if this is working. We have time for just one more question, unfortunately. So thank you, everyone who's stood online. I'm sorry that we'll have to wrap up, but we'll end here.
Okay. Hi. Is modern weaponized culture comparable or even inspired by Marxist ideology?
Who let the kids in? It's a great question. So this is really interesting.
I'm not
as
a
we-
communist.
Yeah, no, I didn't think you were. I have a daughter who's graduating from college in 3 days, and so we have a lot of these discussions, the ideologically based side of identity politics and the weaponization of it. I have chosen to take a much broader definition of the weaponization of culture, i.e., anyone who takes, so you take culture and you take identity politics, which is the division of culture into constituent groups of interests, and then you do something with that that is beyond debate, beyond coming to a lecture, beyond giving a lecture, beyond posting things on blogs, and you do something with it that is meant to affect major social change. To that end, I don't think it belongs to a particular ideology. And one of the things I wanted to point out, that alongside talking about marginalized groups, I wanted to bring in the KKK, and there are many other examples in the world of movements that you wouldn't think come from marginalized people, but who are just threatened in some fashion about their power being removed, and who do very similar things. So I don't believe it's ideologically based, and I made a point to sort of imply that when I'm talking about both identity politics and the weaponization of culture, I'm really talking about social mores and norms. To me, when you take it back to ideology, you're back into having a political debate. And my weaponization of culture means it's not really debate. It's the way we think of other countries where one group of people comes in, takes power, changes the names of all the schools in the streets, and then another one comes in and does the same thing. That's what I feel is happening here. It's just a power dynamic that's not using the established structures of politics. It's using passions and emotions to get people, to motivate people to do things. So I love your question, and I get it, but that's not how I'm interpreting it.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
Let me ask you one last question.
Who are you people? You're very smart. This is unbelievable.
They're Canadians.
It's really.
I'll ask one last question that has come across in a number of these tweets, so I'm sorry I'm not going to credit those of you who contributed these thoughtful questions, but I mean, I'm conscious that we have arguably the best economics reporter on American television here, and we haven't talked that much about economics.
Right. That's my bread and butter. That's what I
Yeah,
like
that is your
about
bread
it.
and butter. And you know, I'll just give a brief anecdote to this question, to preface it. My father was a refugee and was a blue-collar worker, lifelong liberal, supporter of liberal politics. And in 1980, he voted for Ronald Reagan. And I remember as a child sort of being heartbroken by this idea, but his argument was that things are bad, economics are bad, people are losing jobs, people like me in the Rust Belt in Ohio are losing jobs, and you know, we need to support something different. And there's a bit of that going on here.
Yep.
And so how much of this weaponization of culture is connected to whether real or perceived economic disparities, and can we even address this weaponization of culture without
doing it.
addressing?
Not without realizing that that's the case. So Donald Trump isn't just in power because of economically disadvantaged, high school educated white workers who used to be manufacturing workers or mining workers. That's emblematic of it, but there are a lot of people who support Donald Trump because they're evangelicals who believe that the most important topic in American politics is abortion or gun rights. But if you take that aside and you talk about those people who are disaffected, who, by the way, used to be Democrats, as you point out, union leaders, former union members, that typically was a Democratic audience, and they started to, in the last 35, 40 years, move based on what politicians and parties, where they stood on trade, right? If you're a protectionist, you probably got their votes. Democrats tended to be protectionist more than Republicans. That has sort of almost shifted, although both presidential candidates the last time around said that they would rip up the TPP. So it's not clear where politicians stand on this. But ultimately, if you do not accept the idea that the social advances made by certain marginalized groups you have to overlay that on the economic stagnation that is experienced by others. The two go hand in hand. If high school educated white manufacturing workers were employed and doing well, and the coal mines were humming, you don't really care that much if gay people can get a cake.
Or if Mexicans are coming into
or
the
if
country.
Mexicans are coming in. If it's not really, if you don't have some, the zero-summism of this is what is dangerous, right? Tying one thing to another. The economic concerns of many millions of Americans are very, very valid. And for some reason, they feel that those who have advanced other concerns don't hear them. And I think they might be right about that. I don't think they're hearing what these marginalized people's concerns are, and these folks don't understand how white people in America can think that they're marginalized. But you know what? When you had a solid job and you did build the middle class, and now you don't, it feels bad. So I do think that we do have to understand the economic strains that many people are under. I will say, in larger context, unemployment is at a record low in America. Wages are starting to move up. It is a pretty good economy, but that doesn't make it better if you're still unemployed.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Peter.
I want to thank again Ali Velshi for an interesting and thoughtful lecture, and for Peter, who moderated this, and of course to all of you who came out and participated in the conversation. I know that the conversations won't stop tonight, and we've got some ideas of how to move forward and to engage with each other to seek out difficult ideas and conversations, bringing to that discussion an air of civility and an open-mindedness. I want to thank again our evening sponsors, the staff at the Vogue Theatre, and to close by reminding you that in November 5th of this year, we'll have our next installment of the Wall Exchange Lecture, and I hope to see all of you there. Good night and safe travels home.